Okay, good morning again. I am speaking to you from the Garibaldi National Park in British Columbia, Canada. And this is a national forest and a nice natural preserve. No hunting, no taking of natural products or trees or any type of plant, which is an attempt to keep it all natural. I do note there is fishing apparently. I do see people fishing. So fishing is allowed. Sorry, the bugs are here. Bugs are allowed too. All right, here I am, National Forest, clear cut 100 years ago. All these trees have grown back in the meantime. And so they are approximately 100 years old at the most. And there are older stumps, but again, it was clear cut, and you can see evidence of that with big, huge stumps around. Okay, today's topic in the National Forest here is talking about research and my impression that the quality of research over the last year during the worldwide pandemic of COVID-19, it's my impression that the quality of research has diminished over this past, actually now approximately a year and a half. And that is, I review several of the journals, every article, and asked to comment on some articles, and have written probably 100 comments during the past year on articles, mainly in the Journal of the American Medical Association, but also other journals too, and some of them are commented on in the Doctor's Guide, which is published and sent to doctors, I believe online mainly. And then they're also published on ResearchGate. If you want to look them up, you can search my name on ResearchGate, and also on academia.edu. Search my name and you will find over 1,000 different articles that I've written and commented about. There are also approximately 1,000 questions on there too, which are published on ResearchGate and deal with medical topics as well of germane to the current state of medical science. Okay, my first point is you cannot prove a negative, and many of the articles now, studies, attempt to prove a negative and do in their articles say that they've proved a negative. So basically they say that such and such a drug, for example, has no effect on COVID-19 and is not useful and should not be used. The problem with this is usually their study was not of a good enough power to actually prove anything, let alone a negative. Negative, again, is next to impossible to prove. And during my years in medicine and medical research and medical statistics, that the theorem was you cannot prove a negative. It takes so many patients, so much study to get down to an infinitesimal amount of data that it would be required to say, no, this is a negative and the null hypothesis is proven. And that basically never happens or cannot happen. Just an example of that is with radiation research and causing cancer, that you cannot say that there is an infinitesimal amount that does not cause cancer, because every small amount that has been tested can lead to breaks in chromosomes, and so could potentially cause cancer. So there's no way, and no one says that radiation is safe and does not cause cancer at a certain threshold, it's called. So there is no safe threshold for cancer usually. The Prop 65 chemicals, no safe threshold. No safe threshold for things like radiation. So you cannot say going on an airplane is totally safe and will not contribute at all to cancer, because that just is not true. That would be the null hypothesis, and we know the null hypothesis cannot be proven for such things as radiation and carcinogenesis from chemicals, for example. Okay, and then my impression that the medical research has become severely disabled over the past year. And most articles I've read in the past year I consider to be basically not really worthy of publication compared to the literature prior to COVID-19. And the statistical methodology, especially this topic, is used to fudge the data and prove the results, and this has become rampant. So basically, statistics are using methods that, quote, fudge the results. And I will go into more detail on this. But there was the old saying that you can prove anything with statistics. And that is true and becoming even more true. Even the bugs are attacking me here. Okay, now let me add that I'm somewhat of an expert on statistics and medical research, having published about 1,000 studies and articles on various types of research over the years. And that's usually what I write about, and also comment on and evaluate other researchers' publications, especially in the Journal of the American Medical Association. So I think, you might not think so, and maybe other people don't, but I think that I'm a pretty good expert on that topic, and that's where my expertise is coming from on this videotape. Okay, so let's go through some statistical methods for estimating results. Now, usually before they start a major study, they consider what is the power of the study. That is, the percentage of patients that'll have, let's say, an improvement or a change due to the therapy, and how many patients that they need to provide statistical evidence and proof that the medication worked, that the variable, the studied variable that they were using, such as a medication or treatment, actually did have that effect and is proved statistically. So when there's not enough data, which often happens in the last year, they publish anyway. But what they do is they, quote, fudge the results to make the study statistical so they can publish it. Even though the power of the study hasn't been met, by fudging the results, they can come up with a statistical analysis. Now, for many medications such as hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, and studies done on those medications and others for COVID-19, even though the power of some of the studies was not met, the statistical method was used that allowed the input of additional data to fill the gaps, which is what I would call fudging. I mean, it's basically making up the data to fill in the gaps. And then they can say this was either statistically significant, or often what they say is this fulfilled the null hypothesis, N-U-L-L. That means the hypothesis that the medication, for example, had no effect on the treatment of this patient, for example, with COVID-19. So there are many studies that were published last year on hydroxychloroquine that stated basically that the null hypothesis was met, that there was no effect on the treatment of the patient, and so hydroxychloroquine was not recommended for the treatment of COVID-19 patients. Now again, the statistical methods are questionable. Many of them I think are fudge. Data is input into the blank spaces, or if there's not enough cases, that data is copied and put in to make up enough cases to have the power of the study complete. The power is that there's enough patients to make it statistically significant, and you can publish on that when it's that way. So again, that's basically fudging the data, and statistical input of missing data is what one method is. And again, I don't think that is proper. I mean, when I was growing up and learning how to do this, you would never do anything like that. That was called, you know, fraud, basically. So anyway, but apparently it's accepted now. A lot of the big, huge journals are publishing articles that are based on the input of missing data into the equations to prove the study. And again, I guess fortunately it usually proves the null hypothesis, but sometimes it also proves that treatments are beneficial. And that's an even worse scenario. At least with the null hypothesis, you're not recommending treatment for someone based on a falsehood. But when you have statistical significance that you recommend a treatment for patients based on the false input of missing data into the study, and I think that's terrible. And that should not be done. And I try to point that out when I see that in studies. And usually it gets published, but I don't see, usually the articles do not get retracted, although several have been. And you can look those up. Okay, the other thing about research at the present time is that assumptions lead to invalidation of the conclusions, because assumptions are theoretical and made up and may not be true. And because of that, assumptions just validate a theoretical and not the actual truth or conclusion of the study. So when assumptions are made and they're not proven, then the results are just theoretical. And again, that's another invalid way of doing research. There should be no unprovable assumptions that are used. Otherwise, again, the conclusions are just theoretical and based on assumptions that are not proven. Okay, the assumptions create a hypothetical not related to the facts of the case. That's what we used to say in court as an expert witness. And that would basically invalidate the question, which was a hypothetical question to begin with. and not related to the facts in the case. So basically, forget it. And maybe that's what I'm saying about these articles. But again, you need to go through these major articles carefully and see if any of these methods are occurring before you accept the conclusions, or even base treatment on the conclusions. Because otherwise, you could be doing patients harm. And again, as I stated previously, the null hypothesis can never be proven. So this cannot happen. You can state a null hypothesis. That's done in every study, and that's what you're trying to see if either the null hypothesis is correct, or does the treatment that you're rendering actually have a beneficial or even an adverse effect. And you're supposed to publish both of those. Sorry, bugs. You're supposed to publish both of those, but usually only the positive studies are published in the major medical journals. I think maybe because the researchers maybe are embarrassed about or forced not to publish negative results, especially if there's a company producing a drug that they spend a lot of money on. They basically don't want negative publicity. But again, think about that. That's not ethical, if you ask me. Okay, the power of the study must be calculated prior to the study. And again, the power is, do you have enough information, enough data, enough cases to prove your point. And you can calculate ahead of time. If you think, for example, 5% of patients are going to survive over patients who don't get the treatment, then how many patients do you need to have statistical proof to a probability less than 0.05 is the usual criteria. So you can actually calculate ahead of time and determine how many patients you need, and then if you need funding for that, then you ask for so much funding to use so many patients in your study. And that's how usually studies are generated, especially the ones testing a medication such as hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, etc. Obviously, the vaccine studies are a good example of the same thing. Okay, and then the study needs to be continued until there's enough data to prove the case. So if it's a double-blind study, then at certain points it needs to be unblinded so that the statistician, or at least unblinded just to the statistician, so the statistician can determine if the statistical significance has been met for the study yet. Okay, and again, that's usually done when there's enough cases that you've asked for. Let's say you've asked for 300 cases to be treated to meet the power of the study, and so at 300 cases, the code would be broken for the statistician, and hopefully not for the actual researchers, to keep it double-blinded. And then if there wasn't enough cases to make the power of the study to prove statistical significance, then the study could continue at that point with an estimation of how many more patients will be required to prove significance. So that's generally how a study of that type would be done. Okay, the reverse is now done, though, with inadequate data to prove the null hypothesis. And I have to say that the studies I've seen with the political climate these days, that they were probably done for political reasons to prove the null hypothesis, just to make political points. So if you don't have enough patience to actually prove that a chemical is doing a good job medically, and you shut down the study early, you do the statistics, and it's less than a probability of 5% that it helps, which makes it not statistically significant. Then some people now are saying that this fulfills the null hypothesis, even though the study was not adequate. But the null hypothesis, which then they're misinterpreting as the medication has no effect, or even sometimes the medication has an adverse effect. That way eliminated the medication that is politically charged. And there are some good examples of that over the past year and a half during the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, and this again is especially prevalent when there's either not enough funding to get enough cases, or not enough time to get enough cases based on the funding, etc. And because of that, there's inadequate data, and the actual positive effect is not great enough to be statistically significant. So again, unscrupulous people may go back to the null hypothesis and say that it doesn't work. And one of my points is there are multiple studies on vitamins, for example, or some of the other medications that are actually stereoisomers, which are three-dimensional structures that have multiple forms, even though chemically they look identical, but the three-dimensional structures are all different. And nature, the body, chemistry, biochemistry, and all enzymes and proteins in the body are three-dimensional structures. So only certain structures fit like a lock and key mechanism into the three-dimensional network in reality, in life, in biochemistry. So for example, vitamins have multiple carbon atoms in them, and each carbon atom will have 4 centers, and depending on the arrangement of the atoms onto those 4 centers, the stereoisomer can be completely different. And some drugs can have, multiple 16, let's say, different stereoisomers, and only one of them is going to be effective as the medication. Or as a vitamin, only one of those stereoisomers out of 20, let's say, is going to be the actual vitamin. Or in this, let's take a case of vitamin C. Synthetically, you can make ascorbic acid, which looks identical if you look at the arrangement of the atoms to vitamin C. But there are stereoisomers, so there may be only one of, let's say, 8 stereoisomers that is metabolically active as vitamin C. And the other ones can be considered what we call competitive inhibitors. That is, there's a binding site in the cells to either take in the vitamin or for the vitamin to turn on a mechanism in the body, such as prevent scurvy. And if one of the other 7 stereoisomers enters this lock and key mechanism, it blocks it. It's a competitive inhibitor. It inhibits the site, It keeps the real vitamin C from entering, but the cell may think it's vitamin C, but not actually turn on the apparatus to prevent scurvy. Anyway, there are many studies where they don't seem to realize this biochemistry of stereoisomers, and they are using usually a synthetic version which is cheaper, and so I really question the results. They really need to use the natural vitamin that usually comes from food sources, plant sources, or sometimes animal sources, but the natural stereoisomer that the body uses. Because if you're throwing in 90% of the product is an inactive blocking agent, you're not going to get good results with your study. So again, I believe that a lot of the studies, and actually most of the ones involving vitamins that are stereoisomers that I've read, actually involve the synthetic derivatives, which are mainly blocking agents. And so I believe that totally inactivates the vitamin or the chemical from producing a medical effect, and then invalidates the study. Okay, so basically my premise here is that during COVID-19, a lot of socialization, meetings, communication was done electronically. People couldn't go into the labs and interact, and but people still tried to publish studies. I believe a lot of the studies were inadequate, and statistical methods were pushed that were invalid and inaccurate and unethical and maybe even corrupt, if you want to say that. But anyway, I would really look at studies over the last year, and before you consider putting patients on the treatment protocols that are recommended in the studies, just make sure the statistics were good, that there were no false assumptions made or invalid, inaccurate assumptions made, and that the conclusions actually match what the study was designed to do and what the study showed. Okay, I guess that's probably a lot to digest. I will probably continue with more on this series in the future. And if you have any questions, please put them in the comments. Again, please subscribe to my channel, Gary Ordog, O-R-D-O-G. And stay safe, get your vaccination for COVID, and use your mask to prevent the spread of variants that may not be covered by the vaccinations. And please stay safe and have a good life. Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Gary Ordog signing out.